In this lesson, we'll discuss render elements. For each render that you have in the V-Ray frame buffer, there are different render passes or elements. You can choose from different elements for V-Ray to render separately, allowing you to make more separate adjustments to different aspects of your final image, resulting in more fine-tuned control over the post-production. Depending on which elements you choose, it's possible for the separate elements to comprise every component part of your render, so that you can reassemble them back together later in a program like Photoshop. Today, we'll explore how you can do this to recreate the final image, or beauty pass, using separate render elements. To start, go to the V-Ray settings, and in the right flyout menu, you'll see the Render Elements drop-down. When you click on this area here, a list of all the available render elements to choose from will appear. These each capture different information from the image based on their description. For example, let's say we have artificial lights that are illuminating the interior of our house and the palm trees at the back. If we want to easily have control over those lights in post, we can use the lighting render element to capture all that light. The lighting render element stores the direct lighting in your scene. If we had a sun in the scene, its light would also be captured by the lighting render element. In our scene, we also have global illumination enabled, so we will need the GI render element as well. Let's click again in the empty area here and select the GI element from the list. This render element stores all the indirect light that is bouncing around in the scene. If you have reflective materials, which is the case in this scene, we will need the reflection render element as well. As you might guess, it stores all of the reflected light in the scene. Let's click again and scroll down to where it says reflection and add it. If we have glossy materials with the glossiness parameter set below 1, there is a good chance that we will have specular reflections as well. In this case, we do have glossy materials, so let's add the specular render element. If you have any transparent materials like glass or water-like materials, which we have both, we'll need to add the refraction render element as well. Now up to this point, we have added all the render elements that we need to accurately separate all the lighting and shading information in the scene. But that will not be enough to recreate the beauty pass, or in other words, manually reconstruct the final image using its separate render elements. In order to complete the image, we'll still need the background information and the visible garden lights. Usually, you'll find the background render element where the V-Ray sky or any texture that you have placed in the environment background slot is located. However, we do not have any texture here because our sky was loaded in using a dome light. As a result, the background render element will not contain this sky texture. Instead, to add the sky contained in the dome light as well as any other visible light sources, we'll add the self-illumination render element, which contains them all. Now let's add one more render element. This one is a bit special, as it is not a component of the render, but a multi-channel mask. It is called the multi-matte render element, and it uses object IDs to create masks. Specifically, it uses the RGB colors to create a solid fill of the object with either red, green, or blue, depending on the object ID assigned to the object itself. We can then use that solid fill color as a mask. We will see more on how that works in a bit. For now, let's close the asset editor and stop the IPR so we can assign object IDs. You'll see here that all the balls have an ID of 1, so the next ID that I will assign will be 2 for the sidewalk. And then this wall here will be number 3. I will also assign a couple more at random, just to demonstrate how it all works. Okay, we are ready to render, but before we do, a word of caution. Depending on the scene and your compositing goals, you might not need all of the render elements that we have used here, or you might even want to add some additional ones. Just make sure that you do not use more than you need, because adding more render elements can really slow down the render speed quite a bit. When you're ready, let's do a production render. After the render finishes, we can view all the render elements from the list up in the top left here. Here's a glimpse at what some of them look like. I'd encourage you to look at each one and think about why it looks the way it does. You'll also notice, for example, that we have 2 multi-matte render elements, even though we only added 1. That is because V-Ray detected that we assigned more than 3 different object ID numbers. And since a multi-matte is limited to 3 IDs for the red, green, and blue masks, V-Ray automatically created an additional multi-matte for the next set of IDs. Now, let's save all the render elements to separate files. Simply click and hold the floppy disk icon and choose the second from the list, which shows 2 floppy disks, to save all the render elements as separate files. Next, let's go into Photoshop and load all the render elements as separate layers, like I have arranged them on my screen here. The first thing that you might notice is that the render looks different in Photoshop. That's because you can see that I chose to save the result as a 32-bit EXR format, and the V-Ray frame buffer did not save my color corrections. That said, we are looking at the beauty paths right now, so let's hide it and instead put together all the render elements to recreate our own beauty paths. Let's start by selecting the lighting layer, and from the blending modes, select Linear Dodge Add. Then do the same for all the others, except for the multimatte. Now, the beauty paths export from the frame buffer and the one that we have composed here should match exactly. Next, we can use the multimatte to make some more specific adjustments to some of the render elements. For example, the ground looks too reflective. To fix this, let's select the multimatte, go to the channels, and control-click the green channel to make a selection. Next, go back to the layers, hide the multimatte, and select the reflection. Now adjust the exposure. Photoshop will automatically make a correction layer with a mask, which is based on the green channel we selected using the multimatte. Now, let's do the same for the specular. Once we're happy with the result, I'm going to convert everything to 8 bits per channel. Lastly, we can make some color corrections. Feel free to experiment from here on your own. I am simply going to apply a color lookup preset and then save my image as a JPEG file. And that's it. We've now recomposited together the beauty paths, taking advantage of the fine-tuned control we have to make adjustments using separate render elements.